Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reviewing the classic premium vehicle, the French Somua SM, and seeing if it is still any good in today's meta and with the way the tech tree is currently situated. Quite a bit has changed since the Somua SM was first added to the game, including new vehicles getting added to other nations and also France itself, and of course new ranks getting added as well, so it's worth pondering if this old classic still has what it takes. And of course we're going to start where we always do with the overall mobility of the tank. The Somua SM caps at a maximum speed of 4 kph in the forward gears. You can get it up to 30 kph pretty easily because it does have a reasonably powerful engine for its size. However, the reverse gear is fairly lacking at under 6 kph. So you're not exactly going to be backing out of a lot of situations super fast. With that, it's also important to note that the Somua SM does not have neutral steer, so it cannot simply spin in place on its tracks. It has to rotate around one of its two tracks, and this can be a little awkward, especially with the weight of the vehicle and turning around in tight spaces. My advice if you need to turn the Somua SM around is to accelerate forward and then start turning, as this does make the vehicle a lot more responsive. While the Somua SM isn't exactly breaking any speed records, if you were to compare it to other contemporary heavy tanks, it's actually pretty good in the mobility category, especially in terms of its power to weight ratio, even if its reverse gear does leave it lacking. So on the whole, while the mobility isn't exactly going to win you any competitions, it is certainly good enough to get you to where you need to go, and especially compared to other heavy tanks, does compare pretty favorably. In terms of the armor of the Somua SM, the upper front plate is fairly bouncy and can even eat shells like the long 88 depending on the exact range and angle, and even some heavier shells and even early sabos in specific situations. Parts of the turret can likewise be fairly bouncy. However, the biggest weakness is the neck of the vehicle, as this little neck going around the turret can be relatively thin and relatively easy to pen even with lower powered APHE rounds, so it is something you always have to keep an eye on. However, if you keep the vehicle moving and keep the vehicle angled, you can move in such a way so that it is at least an annoying target for your opponent, and especially at long ranges, a lot of enemies are going to struggle to hit it. As far as the side armor, you can't reliably count on it to stop anything, but it isn't paper thin either, so as long as it's not some of the particularly powerful Russian shells that bite into angles very efficiently, you can reasonably angle the vehicle without serious problems in most cases. The Somua SM also features a relatively beefy 5-man crew, so especially if you're facing rounds like early Sabo and Heat that have relatively narrow cones of damage, the likelihood of you dying to a single hit is basically zero unless that shell does hit ammo. Speaking of ammo, the Somua SM features one central drum in the middle of the vehicle, and then you have another smaller rack in the right-hand bustle of the vehicle, and from that point on, it will start loading ammo directly into the hull. And this is one of the problems because these two ammo racks don't contain a ton of ammo, so you will find if you want to take any amount of reasonable ammo to have a good game, you're probably going to have some ammo in the hull, which of course increases the likelihood of ammo detonations. As an interesting aside around this battle rating, a lot of the shells you'll fight are going to be either armor-piercing high explosive rounds that will go into the tank and detonate, or they're heat rounds that have a fairly narrow cone of damage that won't go beyond the first few obstacles, and in both cases taking a shot to the rear of the hull likely won't do anything more than knock out the engine on the Somua. However, this is pretty universal for most tanks at this battle rating. The biggest crux of the Somua in terms of its overall durability isn't necessarily the armor or the layout, but rather that it sits on the borderline of the World War II battle ratings and the Cold War battle ratings. Whereas the Somua is fairly resistant to quite a lot of the World War II era shells, it's also fairly weak to a lot of the Cold War era shells. The saving grace, however, is that like something like the T-32 series for the American line, the shells that can easily one-shot the tank can often struggle to get through its armor, whereas the shells that can easily get through its armor will often struggle to one-shot the tank. So while it does have this annoying feature that you can't always count on the armor, it is at least very usable in many respects, especially if you're familiar with your opponent and what type of shell they have. And lastly, we're getting to the firepower, and this is the area where the Somua SM has both some of its biggest strengths and also some of its biggest weaknesses, and we'll go ahead and get one of those weaknesses out of the way right now. The Somua SM does not have a roof-mounted machine gun. Now, while some of the jets around this battle rating are moving a little too fast for you to reliably engage them, you do run into things like attack helicopters such as the American AH-1G that people will first spawn, and the Somua SM is not great at dealing with them, especially if they're at a decent altitude. The lack of roof-mounted machine gun, however, is definitely a situationable drawback and doesn't come up in all games. Moving on to the main gun, however, it is an unstabilized auto-loaded 100mm cannon. Despite being unstabilized, however, the Somua SM does have a reasonably good suspension, so if you're good at the art of rolling the vehicle to a stop, or you're on flat level ground at low speeds, you can make the gun reasonably stable. The Somua does come with a high explosive round, which is unspectacular, but if you see an open top vehicle, will certainly get the job done. There's nothing really else to say about it. The penetration on it isn't exceptional enough to use it for any really cheeky kills, but of course any open top vehicle, it will basically vaporize if you hit them anywhere. The main shell and the one you're going to be using the most often, your armor piercing cap ballistic cap shell, has a maximum penetration of 273mm, which is a lot, especially given that this tank has a 4-second reload. The problem is it is solid shot AP, so you're dealing with a relatively narrow but at least somewhat concentrated cone of damage. Now, unlike some other solid shots, because the round is such high caliber, it does tend to generate more consistent spalling than some of the other armor piercing solid shot that you might be used to. However, you can still run into a lot of inconsistencies with it. Additionally, that 273mm of penetration may seem impressive on paper, but when you run into some of the beefier Russian heavies, you will realize that it isn't quite enough to reliably pen the common weak points, and a lot of times you will simply have to shoot barrels. Additionally, while the 4-second reload time can allow for some impressively fast follow-up shots, often before the enemy can react to your first shot, the very long reload to get new shells into the magazine is actually pretty abysmal, and with only 8 rounds, if you're in pretty intense fighting, you can run out of ammo pretty quickly and be stuck with some very awkward reload times, or even have to pull back to a capture point. That being said, with these types of autoloaders, I do like to remind people that when you're on a capture point, the ammo that refreshes from the capture point will go straight into your magazine. It will not go into your second or third stage storage. So while you're sitting on that capture point, your crew will be moving ammo from second and third stage storage into the magazine, while the capture point itself will be loading rounds directly into your magazine, so you can get a bit of a 2-for-1 by doing this. The Somua SM's gun is a bit of a roller coaster. The 4-second reload is fantastic, the penetration on the shell is generally pretty good, but then you realize it's also a solid shot and it takes forever to get new shells into that magazine, and it's also unstabilized, but then you also realize the suspension is pretty good, and it's just a very mixed bag all around, but on the whole it is a very functional cannon in the vast majority of cases. Overall, I would characterize the Somua SM as one of those rare tanks that is good enough in basically every area to be considered truly versatile and powerful. The mobility is good enough to get you to where you need to go, even though it isn't amazing. The armor can bounce the odd shell, and that's really all you need out of it, and the gun is very functional in most areas, and even enemies that you can't pen, you can knock out barrels and you have a 4-second reload for a quick follow-up. For me at least, the vehicle managed to basically hit the sweet spot in pretty much every area, to the point where I was very happy with Somua and I felt it was a very good vehicle. But now let's look at how it stacks up to some of the other French premium vehicles around these battle ratings, and also where it sits in the French tech tree. The other French rank 5 premium vehicle the Somua SM is directly competing with is the AMX-30, and the problem with the AMX-30 is that it is essentially a carbon copy of the AMX-30 1972 in the tech tree, except it loses the 20mm autocannon as a coax and replaces it with a 12.7mm. It's not the worst vehicle in the world, but going up to 8.0 does mean fighting a lot more stabilized enemies with its unstabilized gun, which is not exactly great, and it doesn't have the benefit of the fast reload of the Somua SM or even the half-decent armor. All it really has going for it is mobility, which is often somewhat difficult to use. While I generally like the AMX-30 family, this particular version isn't that great as a grinder, simply because it is so unforgiving and so niche in terms of trying to use it without stabilizer, and on top of that, it's not that unique given that there is a very similar tech tree vehicle. Going up to the VBCI in rank 6, and we do see a unique vehicle that doesn't have a direct tech tree equivalent. However, it is a light tank and it is only armed with an autocannon, so its grinding potential is fairly limited, as it takes a lot of skill to learn how to use and what you can do with that autocannon, even though it is at least a pretty functional vehicle, so I wouldn't really recommend that as much of a grinder, even though it is at least a pretty unique pickup. The AMX-30 Super at rank 6 that sits at 9.3 probably gives the Somua SM the closest competition, because it has a fully stabilized gun, it also has fairly good mobility, a punchy shell, a decent reload, and overall isn't that bad in the survivability category, although I definitely wouldn't bait shots with it. I'd also consider the AMX-30 Super to be broadly better than the Tech 3 AMX-32 simply because it has noticeably better mobility. That being said, it is still a pretty unforgiving vehicle, as if you miss any enemy, even if they have a fairly light gun, they're almost certainly going to disable or take you out, unlike the Somua SM, which can be more forgiving in this area. Additionally, the Somua SM with its 4-second reload is more forgiving offensively, because if your first shot doesn't quite do the damage you need, you can simply line up a second one pretty quickly and often before opponents can react, especially as reaction times at 7.7 tend to be lower than they are at 9.3. Obviously, one of the big differences between a rank 5 and rank 6 premium vehicle is what you can research efficiently, and when we look at the vehicles currently available to France, there just isn't that much to research at the higher ranks. At rank 7, all we have is the Leclerc S1 and S2 and the Roland 1, and then at rank 8, all we have is the Leclerc S21, the Leclerc Azur, and the Ito 90M. What this means is that when you're looking at efficiently researching vehicles, you're only missing out on the Leclerc S1 and S2 and the Roland 1 that the AMX30 could efficiently research and the Somua SM can't. Neither of them can efficiently research the rank 8 vehicles, so it's actually a pretty small pool of vehicles, which serves to minimize the difference in rank between the two vehicles. While the AMX30 Super will teach you more about the vehicles that you are researching your way up to, the Somua SM is generally easier to use and will still get you most of the way there on its own. In terms of other French vehicles, this is another area where the Somua really has a big benefit because at 7.7 it has a lot of sister vehicles that you can take along with it, from the AML 90 to the AMX 1390, the Lorraine 40T, the AMX 50 Surbasse, and even other old event vehicles like the EBR 1963 and the AMX 50 TO90 if you just happen to pick those up. This means there are a lot of options around the Somua SM that once you work your way up to them, you could slap a talisman on, and then you have a complete grinding lineup where everything is efficiently researching, which of course makes the process go a lot faster if you have 2 or 3 different vehicles that you can use that all have the ability to research efficiently. So wrapping back around to the final question, is the Somua SM still worth the price tag, which is currently $44.99 US? Obviously, when asking is something worth the price, there is a very subjective element in that it depends on what you personally are comfortable spending, especially on something like a free-to-play game, and of course a bunch of digital ones and zeros that is a virtual tank. That being said, compared to some of the other purchases you could buy, I do think the Somua SM is probably one of the best grinders you can currently get for any nation in the game right now. It is just very versatile, very effective, very easy to have good games in, and it's positioned perfectly within the tech tree to research basically everything you need to, alongside being usable with a very good lineup. Additionally, the Somua SM is actually old enough that it does regularly go on sale whenever they have their pack sales. In fact, I myself got mine for a mere $20 US, which I consider to be an absolute steal considering how good this vehicle is at just grinding an entire tech tree. On top of that, because it is a pack vehicle and not a GE vehicle, when you buy it at a discount, you still get the same number of golden eagles that you would have had you gotten it at full price, and this does give you extra value for it being a pack vehicle. So if you see it on sale and you're looking at grinding your way up the French tech tree, I think this is absolutely an excellent pickup. At full price, it really is kind of subjective as to how much you yourself think a vehicle like this would really be worth, but I still think it's at least worth considering, especially considering it does generally beat out a lot of the contemporary options. But of course, that's just my thoughts on it. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have the Somua? Do you like it, or do you dislike it? Please let me know down in the comments down below. I always love reading that. If you found the video helpful, please leave a like and subscribe. That always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.